For centuries, a single dominant question has shaped the study of economic history. Why did the transformative process of industrialization, the engine of modern sustained economic growth, begin in Western Europe? More specifically, why did it begin in Great Britain? This question is not merely academic. Its answer informs fundamental understandings of global inequality, the nature of economic development, and the very making of the modern world. For a very long time, the prevailing answer has been a story of European exceptionalism. This narrative, in its various forms, posits that Europe possessed some unique internal and long-developing advantage. It could have been a particular cultural trait, a superior set of institutions, more efficient markets, or a unique demographic regime. Whatever the specific ingredient, the core assumption was that the seeds of the Industrial Revolution were sown deep in European soil centuries before they germinated. According to this view, Europe was on a distinct and superior trajectory long before the 19th century. Other parts of the world, by implication, either lacked this crucial ingredient or were burdened by some impediment that prevented them from achieving a similar breakthrough. The rise of the West was therefore seen not as a contingent event, but as the culmination of a long history of slowly accumulating advantages. This established narrative is precisely what Kenneth Pomeranz's work, The Great Divergence, sets out to dismantle. The book enters into a long-standing intellectual tradition, engaging with the foundational ideas of thinkers like Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and Max Weber, all of whom sought to explain this European-centered story. However, it does so by fundamentally challenging their shared premise of long-term European superiority. The book was written at a time when global history as a field was gaining momentum, moving away from nation-state-centric or continent-centric narratives toward a more interconnected and comparative perspective. Pomeranz's work is a landmark of this shift, using rigorous, detailed comparisons to reevaluate the entire historical landscape. The central, provocative argument of the book is this: what if that entire story of exceptionalism is wrong? What if, as late as the year 1750, the most economically advanced parts of Western Europe were not exceptional at all? What if they were, in fact, surprisingly similar to other advanced economic cores, particularly the Yangtze River Delta in China and parts of Japan? This is the book's foundational move, to reframe the debate entirely. Instead of assuming European leadership and searching for its ancient causes, it begins by demonstrating a world of surprising resemblances. It argues that the great split in economic destinies between the East and the West was not the end of a long marathon in which Europe had always been leading. Instead, it was a relatively recent, sudden, and dramatic event that only truly began in the 19th century. The term, the Great Divergence, itself, is meant to capture the sense of a recent parting of ways, not a long-standing gap. The book's explanation for this divergence, therefore, does not look for deep-rooted internal European virtues. Instead, it directs attention to two other crucial factors. First, the global connections that Europe and Europe alone was able to forge, particularly with the Americas. And second, the fortunate contingent availability of key resources, a matter of sheer geographic luck. The story is thus transformed from one of destiny to one of contingency and global context.
The argument of the Great Divergence unfolds through a carefully constructed sequence of 6 parts. This structure is essential to its logic, as it first systematically deconstructs the traditional narrative before building its alternative explanation. The progression is designed to lead the reader through the evidence and reasoning in a deliberate way. The first section, the divergence question, begins by defining the core problem. It lays out the central historical puzzle, why industrialization began in the West, and outlines the traditional Eurocentric answers that the book will challenge. This sets the stage and establishes the terms of the debate. The second section, A World of Surprising Resemblances, forms the empirical bedrock of the book's challenge. This part is dedicated to dismantling the idea of pre-existing European superiority. Through detailed, reciprocal comparisons of living standards, markets, technology, and economic behavior, it presents a compelling case that as late as 1750, the most advanced regions of Eurasia were much more alike than they were different. This is the crucial step that makes the subsequent divergence a genuine puzzle that needs a new explanation. Next, the third section on consumption, capitalism, and coercion delves deeper, investigating other potential areas of European exceptionalism. It examines whether a unique consumer culture or superior capitalist institutions gave Europe an edge. The findings here are nuanced. While consumer demand was robust across Eurasia, Europe's most distinct institutional features were not primarily related to perfecting domestic markets, but rather to projecting coercive power overseas. With the idea of European superiority sufficiently challenged, the fourth section introduces shared ecological constraints. This pivotal part of the argument establishes the common problem that all advanced, densely populated regions across Eurasia were facing. It demonstrates that these economic cores in both Europe and Asia were beginning to hit a fundamental ecological ceiling, facing critical shortages of land-intensive products like fuel, fiber, and food. This shared pressure created a Malthusian bottleneck that threatened to stifle further growth for everyone. This sets the stage for the fifth and most crucial section, a new world windfall. Here, the core of the book's new explanation is revealed. It details how Europe, and Britain in particular, was able to escape the shared ecological bottleneck through two immense and historically contingent windfalls. First, the vast resources of the Americas, secured through colonization, and second, the fortunate geologic placement of abundant coal. Finally, the sixth section, explaining the Great Divergence, synthesizes all the preceding parts. It weaves together the threads of surprising resemblances, shared constraints, and Europe's unique windfalls to construct a coherent, globally contextualized explanation for why Western Europe was able to forge a new economic path, while other equally sophisticated regions could not. The entire argument builds methodically, clearing the ground of old assumptions before erecting its new framework.
So, let's begin with Section 1, the divergence question. The first step in understanding the book's contribution is to grasp the precise nature of the problem it addresses and the traditional narratives that it seeks to overturn. Here is the foundational question that has animated modern social and economic thought for over 2 centuries, a question that preoccupied thinkers from Adam Smith onwards. For almost all of human history, economies across the globe were trapped in what is often called a Malthusian cycle. Any temporary gains in productivity, for instance through a new farming technique or a period of good weather, would lead to an increase in population. This population growth would then consume the extra resources, pushing living standards back down to subsistence levels. Growth was possible, but it was always temporary and reversible. The Industrial Revolution represents the first genuine break from this age-old pattern. It wasn't just another spurt of growth, it was the beginning of sustained economic growth, a process where technological innovation and capital accumulation could consistently outpace population growth, leading to a permanent and dramatic rise in living standards. The question of why this world historical rupture first occurred in Western Europe is therefore the question of how the modern economy itself came into being. The answer to this question inevitably shapes our entire understanding of global economic disparities today, because the patterns of wealth and poverty that define the contemporary world are a direct legacy of this initial divergence. For a very long time, the dominant framework for answering this question has been what Pomeranz calls the Europe-centered story. This is a broad category of explanations, but they all share a common logical structure. The core idea is that the cause of Europe's industrial breakthrough was internal to Europe itself. The narrative asserts that Europe, for centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution, possessed some unique, special quality, a homegrown ingredient for success that other civilizations lacked. This could be a cultural value, an institutional arrangement, a scientific mindset, or a particular social structure. Conversely, it could be framed as other regions lacking something essential that Europe had, or possessing some kind of structural impediment that held them back. In this telling of history, the rest of the world serves as a backdrop, defined by its absences or its failures relative to the European norm. A crucial implication of this viewpoint is how it treats factors like colonialism and overseas trade. In the Eurocentric model, these were not causes of Europe's rise, but rather consequences of a superiority that was already well established. Europe was able to dominate the globe, the story goes, because it was already more dynamic, more innovative, and more efficient. The fundamental assumption is that the divergence was a long-term, slowly unfolding process, and its roots were planted deep in European soil, making its eventual triumph almost inevitable. So, what exactly were these supposed homegrown ingredients of European success? Well, historical literature is filled with candidates. One of the most prominent arguments points to unique demographic patterns, specifically the so-called European marriage pattern. This refers to the tendency in parts of Western Europe for people to marry late and for a significant portion of the population to not marry at all. This, it was argued, acted as a preventative check on population growth, keeping fertility rates lower than in Asia. The supposed result was that Europe could accumulate more capital per person, avoid the worst Malthusian pressures, and foster a more skilled workforce. Another major line of argument focuses on the emergence of more efficient markets. The claim here is that Europe developed markets for land, labor, and goods that were freer, more integrated, and more competitive than anywhere else, allowing for a more efficient allocation of resource, as described in classical economics. A related and extremely influential explanation centers on superior institutions. This school of thought contends that Europe, particularly England, developed institutions that were better at protecting private property rights and enforcing contracts. Secure property rights, in this view, provided the essential incentive for individuals to invest, innovate, and engage in long-term economic planning.
Cultural arguments have also been very popular, ranging from Max Weber's famous thesis linking the Protestant work ethic to the spirit of capitalism, to broader claims about a unique scientific culture born from the Enlightenment that fostered a rational experimental approach to problem solving and thus technological innovation. And finally, some historians have pointed to a consumer revolution, suggesting that a new and insatiable desire for goods emerged first in Europe, creating the demand-side pressures that drove producers to innovate. While these explanations differ in their specifics, they all share that one core assumption. The crucial cause of the divergence was something uniquely and internally European, present long before 1800.
Pomeranz's work begins by fundamentally reframing this entire issue, starting with the timeline. He defines the Great Divergence not as the culmination of a centuries-long story of creeping European superiority, but as a surprisingly recent and astonishingly dramatic split. The evidence presented in the book suggests that this sharp parting of economic paths only truly opened up in the 19th century, after 1800. Before that time, the economic gap between the most developed parts of Europe, like England and the Netherlands, and the most developed parts of Asia, like China's Yangtze Delta, was small and in many respects insignificant. They were, in a sense, on comparable developmental trajectories. This reperiodization is absolutely crucial to the entire argument. If the divergence was a sudden, recent event, then its causes are more likely to be found in recent, contingent factors, rather than in deep-rooted, long-standing cultural or institutional characteristics. It shifts the entire focus of the historical inquiry. The metaphor changes from a long marathon, where the winner was in the lead for most of the race, to a sudden late race breakaway, where one of the lead runners suddenly found an unexpected source of energy. This reframing forces a search for the specific conjunctures and accidents of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, rather than the timeless virtues of European civilization.
This brings us to Section 2, a world of surprising resemblances. To effectively challenge the deep-seated narrative of European exceptionalism, the book's first major task is to demonstrate empirically that before the 19th century, the advanced economies of Europe and Asia were not on fundamentally different tracks. In fact, they were profoundly and surprisingly similar. This quote from the book reveals its core methodological innovation, a principle of reciprocal comparison. For centuries, the comparative exercise was one-sided. Historians would take the path of English or European development as the universal model, the historical norm. Then they would look at other regions, like China or India, and ask why they failed to replicate this path. The questions were always framed as, why wasn't China more like England? This approach inherently privileges the European experience and treats all other historical trajectories as deviations or failures. Pomeranz flips this on its head. He insists on asking the question in both directions. So alongside the traditional question, he asks the reverse. Why wasn't England the Yangtze Delta? This is not just a clever rhetorical trick, it's a profound analytical shift. It forces the historian to recognize that both regions had their own complex, internally coherent developmental paths. It requires explaining the European outcome just as much as the Chinese outcome, without assuming that one was the default for progress. This method of reciprocal comparison is essential for escaping the trap of Eurocentrism. It treats both regions as puzzles to be explained, seeing each through the lens of the other, and thereby revealing that Europe, too, could have plausibly ended up on a trajectory that looked much more like East Asia's highly sophisticated, labor-intensive path. The divergence was not a foregone conclusion.
One of the most foundational claims of the European exceptionalism narrative is that Europeans enjoyed a significantly higher standard of living long before industrialization. The traditional image is of a well-fed European population consuming more meat and calories, contrasted with an impoverished Asian peasantry living on the edge of subsistence. This material advantage was supposedly linked to the European marriage pattern, which controlled population and allowed for greater savings and capital accumulation. Pomeranz systematically challenges this entire picture. By carefully examining a range of evidence, including data on wages, consumption, and life expectancy, he demonstrates that this supposed gap is largely a myth. For example, life expectancy figures for England and the Yangtze Delta in the 18th century were remarkably similar. While Europeans did have different demographic strategies, it turns out that East Asians practiced effective fertility control through other means, such as infanticide, thus also keeping population pressures in check. In terms of material comfort and consumption, the resemblances are just as striking. Far from being a European monopoly, the consumption of everyday luxuries was widespread in the developed cores of Asia. In fact, the evidence suggests that in the mid-18th century, per capita sugar consumption was likely higher in parts of China than in most of Europe. Overall, the available data simply does not support the idea of a pre-existing significant gap in living standards between the most advanced parts of Eurasia.
What about technology? Surely this is where Europe had a clear, long-standing advantage. The reality, the book argues, is far more complex.
By the 18th century, it is true that Europe had developed an edge in certain types of technology, particularly those that saved labor. The use of wind and water power for milling and other industrial processes was more widespread in Europe, for instance. However, focusing only on labor-saving technology tells only half the story, and it reflects a Eurocentric bias. In a world where the primary economic constraint for everyone was a scarcity of land, technologies that saved land were just as, if not more, critical. And in this domain, East Asia, and particularly China, was the undisputed world leader. Chinese agriculture was far more intensive, sophisticated, and efficient in its use of land. They employed advanced techniques of fertilization, irrigation, crop rotation, and resource recycling that allowed them to produce far more food and fiber per acre than their European counterparts. So this was not a simple case of an advanced Europe versus a backward China. Rather, it was a situation of different technological paths, each a rational and sophisticated response to the specific resource endowments and pressures of its region. Europe was moving along a path that emphasized saving labor, while China was on a path that emphasized saving land. Before 1800, it was not at all clear which of these paths represented a more promising future.
Perhaps one of the most startling and counterintuitive arguments in the book relates to the nature of markets. The traditional narrative, deeply influenced by classical economics, claims that Europe was the first to develop free and efficient markets, a key prerequisite for capitalism. Pomeranz turns this idea completely on its head through a detailed comparison of land markets. In the late 18th century, European land markets were far from the free market ideal. They were frequently entangled in a complex web of pre-capitalist restrictions. These included customary rights of tenants, the existence of common lands that couldn't be sold, and various seigneurial privileges held by aristocrats. Land in many parts of Europe was not yet a fully alienable commodity that could be freely bought and sold by anyone. In stark contrast, Chinese land markets had been remarkably free, private, and active for centuries. The buying, selling, and renting of land was a common practice, largely unencumbered by the kinds of customary restrictions found in Europe. In fact, if an 18th century economist like Adam Smith had been looking for a real-world example of a competitive, frictionless market for land, he would have been much more likely to find it in the Yangtze Delta than in England or France. By the standards of neoclassical economics, China's markets were arguably more developed and efficient.
The story for labor markets follows a similar, counterintuitive pattern. The conventional wisdom paints a picture of a dynamic, free workforce in Europe contrasted with a static, tradition-bound peasantry in Asia. Once again, the evidence suggests something closer to the opposite was true. European labor markets in the 18th century were still characterized by significant rigidities. Guilds persisted in many cities, controlling entry into skilled trades and restricting competition. Barriers to migration, both legal and customary, often prevented labor from moving freely to where it was most needed. And various forms of unfree or compulsory labor, from serfdom in the East to other obligations in the West, remained common. In comparison, China's labor markets appear surprisingly modern and flexible. There was largely an absence of hereditary occupational status, a son was not bound to follow his father's trade. Long-distance migration in search of economic opportunity was a common and accepted feature of life, creating a highly mobile and responsive workforce. When examined closely, the institutional frameworks governing labor in China were arguably less restrictive and closer to a free market ideal than those found in most of pre-industrial Europe. So given these similar market contexts and living standards, how were ordinary families behaving economically? Here, the concept of the industrious revolution, first proposed by historian Jan de Vries, becomes a crucial analytical tool. The industrious revolution describes a fundamental shift in household behavior that preceded the Industrial Revolution. It refers to a process where families began to reallocate their time and effort. They worked harder and for longer hours, and they directed more of their family labor, including that of women and children, away from producing goods for their own consumption and toward producing goods for the market. The goal of this increased industry was to earn cash income, which could then be used to purchase a growing array of new consumer goods available in the marketplace, things like sugar, tea, tobacco, and new kinds of textiles. Pomeranz's key contribution is to show that this industrious revolution was not a uniquely European phenomenon. The exact same shift in household economic strategy was happening in the advanced regions of China and Japan during the same period. Households across Eurasia were responding rationally to new market opportunities and consumer desires. This provides yet more powerful evidence against European exceptionalism, demonstrating that the micro-level behaviors and economic mentalities often associated with the rise of capitalism were in fact a shared feature of developed economies across the Old World. The unavoidable conclusion drawn from this extensive comparative exercise is both simple and revolutionary. As late as the middle of the 18th century, there was no clear European economic leader on the world stage. The picture that emerges is not one of a dynamic Europe poised for takeoff while the rest of the world stagnated. Instead, it is a picture of a polycentric world with multiple, comparable economic cores. The most developed regions in Western Europe, such as England and the Netherlands, shared a host of crucial features with the most developed regions in East Asia, like China's Yangtze Delta and parts of Japan. They all had highly commercialized economies, sophisticated markets, similar living standards, and populations that were responding to market incentives in remarkably similar ways. Furthermore, and this is critical for the next stage of the argument, they were all beginning to run up against similar ecological constraints that threatened to cap their future growth. This conclusion fundamentally alters the historical problem. The puzzle is no longer explaining Europe's long-term built-in superiority. The real puzzle, the one the rest of the book seeks to solve, is this. If these regions were so similar, what happened after 1750 to create such a massive and rapid divergence in their economic fortunes?
This leads directly to Section 3, Consumption, Capitalism, and Coercion. Since the foundational economic structures and living standards were so similar, the search for a key difference must continue. Perhaps the explanation lies not in the basics of production and markets, but in other, more subtle areas. Was it a uniquely dynamic consumer culture in Europe, or perhaps a more potent form of capitalism that ultimately made the difference? One prominent argument for European exceptionalism centers on the idea of a uniquely European consumer revolution. The theory suggests that a new culture of consumption, a widespread desire for novel luxuries that became everyday necessities, like sugar, tea, coffee, and fashionable textiles, created a powerful engine for economic change. This burgeoning demand, it is argued, pushed producers to innovate and reorganize production to meet it, ultimately sparking the Industrial Revolution. But was this consumer's mindset unique to Europe? The evidence presented by Pomeranz suggests that it was not. When looking at the per capita consumption of key goods around 1750, the patterns are, once again, surprisingly similar. For example, sugar, often seen as a quintessential product of the new consumerism, was likely consumed in greater quantities per person in parts of China than in Europe at the time. The production and consumption of textiles in the Yangtze Delta was on a scale comparable to, if not greater than, that of Britain. It seems that robust and dynamic consumer demand was a feature of wealthy, commercialized societies across Eurasia, not a European monopoly. This finding significantly weakens the claim that a unique consumer culture was the primary trigger for Europe's industrial breakthrough.
If it wasn't consumerism, then perhaps the difference lay in a superior form of capitalism, embodied in more effective business institutions. And it is true that Europe did develop certain distinctive institutions, such as the Chartered Joint Stock Company, like the British East India Company. These were powerful organizations capable of mobilizing vast amounts of capital. However, Pomeranz makes a critical point about where and how these institutions were most effective. They were not, for the most part, being used to revolutionize domestic manufacturing or agriculture. Their primary sphere of operation and their main competitive advantage lay in three interconnected areas: waging war, conducting armed long-distance trade, and establishing and managing colonies. Europe's most unique and powerful capitalist tools were inextricably linked to the state's capacity for organized violence and its ability to project that power across the oceans. The real European institutional advantage, therefore, appears to lie not in the realm of free markets at home, but at the violent intersection of commerce and coercion on a global scale. This was a capitalism honed for overseas expansion and extraction.
This focus on overseas coercion naturally brings up the role of colonialism and slavery. The classic argument on this topic is the Williams thesis, named after the historian Eric Williams. His claim was that the profits from the Atlantic slave trade and the sugar plantations in the Caribbean were a primary source of the financial capital that funded Britain's Industrial Revolution. For decades, this thesis has been debated, and the general scholarly consensus that emerged was that Williams was wrong, at least in a direct sense. Economic historians calculated that while the profits were certainly enormous for those involved, they were simply too small as a percentage of Britain's total national investment to have been the decisive funding source for industrialization. But Pomeranz argues that this entire debate, focused as it is on financial capital, completely misses the real significance of the New World. The true, world-altering importance of the Americas to Europe was not the money it generated. It was the immense, unprecedented access it provided to a vast new supply of physical resources and, effectively, land. The crucial contribution was not financial, but ecological. The New World provided an ecological relief valve that solved a fundamental resource problem, a problem that simply couldn't be solved with money alone.
So putting the pieces together from this section, a clearer picture of Europe's distinctiveness begins to emerge. It was not found in superior domestic markets, more rational households, or unique consumer culture. The truly crucial difference in Europe's political economy lay in its peculiar state system. Europe was a continent of multiple competing states. This constant interstate military competition, often cited as a driver of European dynamism, was indeed critical. However, its primary effect was not, as is often claimed, to force states to perfect their domestic markets or protect property rights to foster growth. Instead, its most significant outcome was to hone the fiscal military capacity of states to project violent power across vast distances. This honed capacity for organized coercion is what enabled the conquest and exploitation of the Americas. And this, in turn, allowed Europe to establish a unique and profoundly asymmetrical core-periphery relationship with its Atlantic colonies, securing access to the land-intensive products that would become its ecological lifeline. The key differences in European capitalism and state formation all point in the same direction toward the critical importance of overseas connections built on force.
This brings us to Section 4, Shared Ecological Constraints. To fully appreciate the monumental importance of Europe's ecological lifeline from the New World, it is first necessary to understand the severity of the problem that it solved. And that problem was a looming ecological ceiling that was threatening to halt economic growth across all of the most advanced regions of Eurasia.
By the late 18th century, the most developed economic cores of Eurasia were all beginning to press hard against their local ecological limits. This was not a problem unique to one region. It was a shared dilemma. In both Western Europe and East Asia, centuries of population growth and economic activity had led to widespread deforestation. This created growing shortages of wood, which was the primary source of fuel for homes and industries, as well as the essential building material for everything from houses to ships. The prices for timber and firewood were rising everywhere, signaling a critical scarcity. At the same time, there was immense pressure on agricultural land. Growing populations needed more food, which meant a constant need to convert forests and pasture into cropland. This created a direct trade-off. More land for food meant less land for grazing animals and less land for growing timber. And finally, the production of fiber for the booming textile industries was incredibly land-intensive. In Europe, producing wool required vast tracts of pasture land for sheep. In China, growing cotton also consumed huge amounts of agricultural land. The fundamental point is that all of these essential products, fuel, food, fiber, and building materials, were competing for the same finite resource, land. All advanced economies were facing a critical shortage of land-intensive products, creating a bottleneck that made continued growth along the old paths increasingly difficult.
Of course, the most logical response to a local resource shortage was to try to solve it through long-distance trade. And indeed, all the advanced Eurasian cores attempted to do this. Britain imported large quantities of timber and grain from the Baltic region in Eastern Europe. The Yangtze Delta and China engaged in a massive, sophisticated trade network with its own vast interior, importing rice, timber, and soybeans from less developed peripheral regions. However, Pomeranz argues forcefully that this old-world, intra-continental trade could only ever be a temporary and limited solution. There were two fundamental problems. First, transportation costs, especially for bulky goods over land, were prohibitively high. This limited the effective distance from which resources could be drawn. Second, and more importantly, there was a structural issue. These peripheral regions in the Old World had their own populations and their own economic logics. They were not structured solely to serve the needs of the core. They lacked the wealth and the population density to become massive markets for the core's manufactured goods. This meant that the potential for a balanced, large-scale exchange of raw materials for finished products was severely limited. Trade within the Old World could provide some marginal relief, but it could not provide the truly game-changing, massive influx of resources that would be required for a fundamental industrial breakthrough. So, if every advanced economy in Eurasia was facing the same ecological wall, and if trade within the Old World couldn't break through it, how did Europe alone escape? This brings us to Section 5, a new world windfall. The answer, according to Pomeranz, lies not in Europe's internal genius, but in its unique access to two massive, historically contingent, and ecologically transformative windfalls. To properly grasp the sheer scale and importance of these windfalls, Pomeranz introduces a brilliant analytical concept he calls ghost acreage. Ghost acreage is a way of measuring the ecological relief a country receives from external sources. It poses a hypothetical question. How many acres of a country's own domestic land would have been needed to produce a given quantity of an imported product? For instance, how many acres of British farmland would have been required to grow the amount of sugar that Britain imported from the Caribbean? Or, in a slightly different application, how many acres of British forest would have needed to be harvested each year to produce an amount of energy equivalent to the energy Britain got from mining coal? This clever concept allows for the translation of various inputs, imports like cotton and sugar, and energy sources like coal, into a single comparable metric, land. It makes it possible to quantify, in a very direct and intuitive way, the extent to which Europe was able to relieve the pressure on its own land base. The first of the two great windfalls was the Americas, and the concept of ghost acreage reveals its staggering scale. By the early 19th century, the amount of ghost acreage that Britain effectively gained from its New World imports was immense. Just considering the land needed to grow its imported sugar and cotton, and to replace the timber imported from the Americas, the total comes to over 25 million acres. To put that number into perspective, that is an area of land larger than all of the arable and pasture land in England and Wales combined. This was an ecological boon of almost unimaginable proportions. It meant that Britain could fuel its world-changing cotton textile industry, the leading sector of the Industrial Revolution, without having to sacrifice a single acre of its own land that was needed for growing food. It could feed its population's growing demand for sugar without converting green fields into sugar beet fields. In essence, the New World allowed Britain to blow the lid off the fundamental land constraint that was progressively boxing in every other economy in Eurasia. It was this massive relief, secured through colonization and slavery, that provided the physical resources necessary for a new kind of resource-intensive growth.
The second, parallel windfall was coal. Coal represented a massive, subterranean trove of stored solar energy from millions of years past. Its exploitation was, in effect, another form of ghost acreage. By 1815, the energy Britain derived from burning coal was equivalent to the energy that could have been harvested annually from over 15 million acres of forest. Without access to coal on this scale, Britain would have inevitably faced a catastrophic fuel crisis. Its forests were already depleted, and the price of wood was soaring. The iron industry, textile factories, and steam engines that powered the Industrial Revolution were all incredibly energy-hungry. Without coal, this energy demand would have been impossible to meet, and industrialization would have ground to a halt. Coal provided the energy breakthrough just as the Americas provided the land breakthrough. The combination of these two massive sources of ghost acreage, land-intensive products from the periphery and subterranean energy from below, was the unique 1-2 punch that allowed Britain to escape the shared Eurasian ecological predicament. No other region in the world had access to both.
But the story of coal is not just about its existence. It is critically about its location. This is where the element of pure contingency and geographic luck plays a decisive role. Britain was not the only place with large coal deposits. China, for instance, also had enormous reserves. The crucial difference was geology and geography. Britain was incredibly fortunate. Its largest coal fields were located very conveniently, near its major population centers, its emerging industries, and most importantly, close to navigable rivers or the coast. This meant that the coal could be transported cheaply and easily to where it was needed. In stark contrast, China's geographic luck was terrible. Its largest coal deposits were located in the arid northwest of the country, primarily in Yangtze province. This was hundreds and hundreds of miles away from its economically dynamic core in the Yangtze Delta. In the age before railways, the cost of transporting a heavy, bulky commodity like coal over such a vast distance overland was prohibitively expensive. So, while China had plenty of coal, it might as well have been on the moon. It remained locked in the ground, unusable. Britain's decisive energy advantage, therefore, stemmed not from some superior ingenuity or institutional foresight, but from the brute fact of its fortunate geology.
This brings us, finally, to Section 6, explaining the Great Divergence. Now, all the pieces of the puzzle can be brought together to construct the book's full, revised explanation for the making of the modern world economy. The argument can be summarized in a clear, 4-step causal sequence. The first step is establishing the baseline, a world of similar cores. Around 1750, the most advanced commercialized regions in Western Europe and East Asia were much more alike than they were different. They were developmental peers facing similar opportunities and challenges. The second step introduces the common problem, shared ecological constraints. All of these advanced cores were beginning to hit an ecological ceiling. Their continued growth was being threatened by a fundamental shortage of land and land-intensive products, creating a Malthusian bottleneck that affected everyone. The third step provides the crucial turning point, Europe's contingent windfalls. Europe, and specifically Great Britain, was able, through a combination of colonization and geographic luck, to gain access to two massive and unique sources of ecological relief. These were the vast land-intensive resources of the New World and huge and conveniently located deposits of coal. This access was the critical factor that no other region shared.
The fourth and final step explains the outcome, a new path. This unprecedented ecological relief unshackled the British economy from the constraints that continued to bind its Eurasian peers. It allowed Europe to pursue a new and unique developmental trajectory, a resource-intensive and capital-intensive path to industrialization. Meanwhile, East Asia, lacking such windfalls, had to continue down its already sophisticated but ultimately constrained path of intensifying the use of its own scarce resources, a path that was highly labor-intensive. The divergence was born at this fork in the road.
This leads to the central thesis of the entire book. Europe's industrial breakthrough was not an isolated internal achievement, a European miracle. Instead, the world's first modern industrial core, located in Western Europe, and its first modern resource extraction periphery, located in the New World, were created together, in tandem. They were two inseparable sides of the same historical process. The dynamic growth in the European core was structurally dependent on the resources extracted from the American periphery through coercive labor systems. This was the critical global conjuncture, a specific and unique coming together of factors that allowed Europe to break away from the pack of other advanced Eurasian economies. It was the intersection of Europe's internal market development with its external colonial resources and its fortunate domestic geology. The divergence, therefore, was not born from internal European superiority, but from a unique set of interactions on a global scale.
In its final analysis, The Great Divergence offers a radical reinterpretation of the origins of the modern world. The economic split between West and East is recast not as the inevitable fulfillment of a long foretold European destiny, but as a relatively late, surprisingly abrupt, and deeply contingent outcome. Its causes are to be found not in timeless cultural virtues or superior institutions that were unique to Europe for centuries, but rather in a specific global conjuncture of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. This conjuncture was defined by the violent acquisition of an overseas periphery, which provided immense ecological relief, combined with the sheer good luck of accessible fossil fuels. This perspective does not deny the remarkable technological and social transformations of the Industrial Revolution. Instead, it places them within a more complete and complex global context, revealing that forces, resources, and connections far outside Europe's borders were not peripheral to its unique breakthrough, but were in fact absolutely central to it.